Hello, everyone. We're in Times Square, the crossroads of the world. And today we're going to discuss how Times Square became Times Square. This is the Times Square everybody knows today, with all the lights, all the crowds, the theaters, and of course the big New Year's Eve celebration. But it didn't always look like this. At one time, it was a very different place. So this is the same view from about 120 years ago. Very different looking, right? Back then, this was known as Longacre Square. So, how did we go from this to this? End of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, Longacre Square was known as the hub of New York City's carriage industry. So this neighborhood, there weren't many paved streets. It was muddy, it was dirty, and up here is where you would find carriage shops, you would find horse stables, you would find blacksmiths, you would find horse exchanges. Really dirty, smelly neighborhood. But that was about to change. And that change began with this dapper gentleman, Oscar Hammerstein I. Now, you might recognize that name because he has a very famous grandson, Oscar Hammerstein II, who wrote a slew of iconic Broadway musicals, mostly in his partnership with Richard Rodgers, shows like Oklahoma, Carousel, King and I, Sound of Music. All these great titles come from Oscar Hammerstein II. But Oscar Hammerstein I also had an influence on the theater. Now, originally, Oscar Hammerstein I was a cigar manufacturer. He held the patent on 70 different techniques to manufacture cigars. And he was very successful. He made a lot of money. And he loved the theater, he loved the opera, and he would take his profits and he would funnel that into building theaters, presenting shows and operas. He thought of himself as an impresario. He wasn't terribly successful with that. He often ran into bankruptcy more than once, but he did manage to start off this area as a center for theater. And how that happened is that in 1894, Oscar Hammerstein I, he got word from his friends in the city government that the city was about to, they just approved a plan to create an underground train, an electric underground train, the first subway. And it was going to run right through this area. And he thought, this is it. And he bought a big piece of land right here on Broadway, from 44th Street to 45th Street, a full city block, and he built the first theater in this neighborhood. It was known as the Olympia, and it was actually theaters. There were 4 performing spaces in one, in this one building. You had a music hall, you had a theater, a concert hall, and a rooftop garden performance space. It also featured cafes and a bowling alley below street level. The theater opened in November of 1895. Unfortunately for Oscar, the planned subway would not open for another 9 years. He was too early. And within a couple of years, Oscar Hammerstein I went into bankruptcy. He had to sell off the theater. It was taken over by a number of other producers. In fact, Florenz Ziegfeld took over the rooftop garden, and that is where he created the first world-famous Ziegfeld Follies. But Oscar Hammerstein, it's as if he tapped into some kind of special magic when he built that first theater, because from then up through 1930, there was a building boom in this neighborhood of theaters. By 1930, there were over 90 legitimate theaters in this neighborhood. It was the largest concentration of theaters in the entire world. Of course, the Great Depression settled in, and many of those theaters failed, and they fell to the wrecking ball, but we still have about 40 of them left here in this neighborhood. But Oscar Hammerstein I is the visionary who actually saw this neighborhood as a place to build theaters. When he came back from bankruptcy, he built several other theaters in this neighborhood. One of them still stands today from 1900. It's now known as the New Victory Theater. You can see it over on 42nd Street. Now, about the same time that Oscar Hammerstein is building his first theater, electronic advertising is starting to take hold. In 1879, Thomas Edison introduced the electric light bulb, and just 13 years after that, 1892, the very first electronic billboard appears in New York City. O.J. Good, a specialist in outdoor advertising, billboard advertising, saw the potential of the Edison bulb immediately, and boy, he ran with it. And so in 1892, he erected the city's first electronic billboard. It was about a mile from here at 23rd Street and Broadway, which at the time was the center of the city's theater and restaurant industry. The billboard was 50 feet by 80 feet. It had 1,457 light bulbs. But as the theater started to move up Broadway towards Longacre Square, so too did the electronic billboards. By the first decade of the 20th century, Times Square area would be ablaze in light. And in 1917, O.J. Good unveiled his masterpiece. It was the Wrigley Gum sign. The sign was 200 feet long, nearly 100 feet high. It stretched on the west side of Broadway, a full city block from 43rd Street to 44th Street. The sign used 17,500 light bulbs. People would come from all over the world to marvel at this and the many other electronic displays of Times Square, and they still do today. So we have the theaters, we have the lights, and now we get to the name change from Longacre Square to Times Square. And this is the man who makes that happen. His name is Adolph Oakes, and he's the owner and publisher of the New York Times from 1896 until 1935. Like most newspapers of the early 19th century, the New York Times was headquartered way downtown, right near City Hall. But in 1904, with the arrival of the new subway system, Adolph Oakes decides he will move the New York Times headquarters up to Longacre Square. He figures the subway, which is going to stop right there at 42nd Street, will be an ideal way to distribute the newspaper a lot quicker throughout the city. Construction on the Times Tower will begin in 1904. It'll be the second tallest building in New York City, and the city will rename Longacre Square Times Square in its honor. The Times officially takes residence in the tower in 1905, but December 31st of 1904, the Times decides to have a really big new party to celebrate, a block party to celebrate their new headquarters. And at midnight, they set off fireworks from the top of the building. Well, this was incredibly popular, and so the next year, the Times decided they would do it again. They would have another celebration, and they would set off fireworks, and then they did it again the following year. Well, by 1907, the city got very concerned because growing up around the Times Tower now were a lot of taller buildings. The Times Tower, when it opened, was the second tallest building in the city, but it created a building boom in that neighborhood, that and the subway. And so by 1907, the city came to the Times and said, you know what? You cannot set off fireworks from the top of the building. It is too much of a fire hazard. You're going to have to, you just can't do it. And the Times was like, well, wait a minute. We have to do something. I mean, people are expecting this now. This is a thing, you know? And so they borrowed an idea from the Western Union building. The Western Union building was down on Lower Broadway. It was the tallest building in downtown at the time. And at the top of the Western Union building, there was a really long flagpole. And every day at noon, they would drop a ball down the flagpole. And that was so that all the ships in the harbor could synchronize their chronometers to local time. And so the Times said, we're going to do that. We're going to drop a ball. We'll put some electric lights on it. It'll be really cool. And that's what they did. And ever since 1907, we've been dropping a ball down a pole at the top of the Times Tower. Now, the Times Tower, the Times moved out. A few years later, they had outgrown their space, and so they had to move on. But the tower still remains today, although you will only see most of it. You'll see electronic billboards. It's covered up with electronic billboards. There's almost no tenants in that building anymore, okay? Because they don't need it. They make all their money renting the space on the outside of the building to those electronic advertisers. There is one tenant that is a Walgreens pharmacy, and that takes up the first 3 floors of the tower, but the rest of the building today is actually empty. So that building is the focus of New Year's Eve. Every New Year's Eve, the ball drops. People come from all over the world, millions of people. The police pen them in. The people start arriving there at 11, 12 in the afternoon, waiting for that midnight drop. And once you're in, you can't get out. The police close off the barricades block by block once they fill up. They're jam-packed with people. You're not allowed to bring things in. You're not allowed to go out. If you leave, you cannot get back in. And there are just a handful of porta potties. So That's kind of why everybody's dancing at night, you know, at midnight, because they've been standing there for hours without a bathroom. Although there is an urban legend that the Walgreens in the former Times Tower does a record business in Depends every December 31st. But I'm telling you right now, the best way to watch that ball drop is actually from your living room sofa. So there it is, folks, our little tourette of Times Square and how it became Times Square.